across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar Friends. Tonight, that's Rachael Cunliffe from the New Statesman and Sam Lister from the Express. And you, I'm happy to say, join in, send me a text, send me a tweet, watch on YouTube, and just join in generally. Always glad of your company and your thoughts. After the news with Laura Cook.
Thank you. Good evening. The government and the Conservatives have apologised for a British military data leak that risks the lives of up to 100,000 Afghans. The breach was then kept secret by successive governments, with an unprecedented super injunction that's been lifted today after a 2-year legal battle spearheaded by the Times. It was feared the database of 33,000 records would have given the Taliban what amounted to a kill list. It's not clear if the leaked information actually reached the Taliban. Tan Tasai is chair of the Defence Select Committee.
This whole data breach and super injunction situation is an absolute mess, and it's wholly unacceptable. It's shameful, I think, that those Afghans who bravely supported our service personnel are now at risk, and they could be subject to reprisals or recrimination. That's really, really concerning. We must ensure that processes are put in place, that there is no repeat of such a scenario.
John Pienaar's 2-decade career on MasterChef has come to an end after an allegation that he made a racist remark was upheld. The 59-year-old chef will not have his contract on the programme renewed following the publication of an independent report. Earlier, the show's bosses insisted the programme can survive after more than 40 allegations of inappropriate behaviour against host Greg Wallace were also found to be true. The corporation's annual report reveals several recent sackings. It's also published the salaries of top executives and talent. The Chancellor will say regulation acts as a boot on the neck of businesses when she makes a speech to city bosses later. Rachel Reeves will lay out sweeping reforms at Mansion House aimed at delivering growth. Among them, she's hoping more first-time buyers will be able to get a mortgage with simplified rules. Senior money reporter George Nixon has explained the scheme by sharing this analogy.
The PRA and the Bank of England are mum and dad, and they say that the curfew for all the kids, which are all the banks, to be home after a night out is 10:30. If you've been a good kid, for example, if you're Nationwide or Yorkshire Building Society, who have been told by the Bank of England that they can lend more than 15%, you're allowed to come home at 11. That's kind of what it is. So the Treasury thinks that there will be about 36,000 a year more first-time buyers that will be able to basically borrow enough to buy a property.
Police say they've recovered 3 of 4 bodies from a plane that crashed at Southend Airport on Sunday. All on board were foreign nationals and included a commander, co-pilot and doctor who were men and a female nurse. The aircraft had dropped off a patient and was due to return to its base in the Netherlands when it crashed. The airport remains closed. And 2 former friends have been jailed for more than 4 years each for cutting down the Sycamore Gap tree in September 2023. Daniel Graham and Adam Carruthers drove from Carlisle in the middle of the night and filmed themselves felling the famous Northumberland landmark. The sentencing judge accused the pair of bravado and revelling in the thrill of it and the following media coverage. Christopher Atkinson is from the Crown Prosecution Service.
Since the felling of the tree, both men have tried to evade the consequences of their criminal actions, cynically lying about the part they each played of blaming each other for the mindless destruction of this historic landmark.
The National Trust says the tree can never be replaced. And for news when you want it, subscribe to our podcast, The Times News Briefing and The World in 10.
Across the UK, on DAB Digital Radio, on the Times Radio app, and on your smart speaker.
Pienaar Friends on Times Radio with Barclays Business Banking.
It is good to have you here with us on Pienaar Friends, an hour of good conversation in good company. Tonight, that is the Associate Editor of The Express, Sam Lister. Hello, Sam.
Hi, John.
Good to see you, and Rachael Cunliffe from the New Statesman. Hello, Rachel.
Hello.
Rachel, I'll come to you first. What's your thought for the day?
So I am still thinking about this More in Common report, Shattered Britain, which came out yesterday, which segments British society into these 7 new groups. I don't know, are you, John, are you a sceptical scroller, you're a rooted patriot, progressive activist? We've all been sort of doing the quiz and all of that. But the thing that came out to me from the report was what unites all of these groups, regardless of, age, class, demographic, political persuasion, is a sense that something is broken in politics, sort of loss of trust. All of them have net negative trust towards politics and our politicians. And that actually tracks with the British Social Attitude Survey that came out last month, that I think showed that only 12% of us have any trust in our politics, which is the lowest on record. So it's not just, people have never trusted politicians. It is actively getting worse.
Yes.
And I think we're going to be talking on the show later today about an incident which may enhance that sense that we can't trust our politics and our politicians. But it's really damaging. And I think that on everything from sort of immigration to the cost of living crisis, you see people who not only think that the present situation isn't working, but just don't have any faith that it's going to get better. And partly that's because they've been told it's going to get better. I mean, we've been told that the economic situation will improve since the financial crash in 2008. We've had over a decade and a half of waiting for when a thing's going to get better. Similarly, on immigration, you've had successive governments promising to bring numbers down and then doing the opposite. But when the public lose faith in the political system to this degree, I think you start to see all kinds of quite strange things happening, whether that's fringe parties, whether that's people sort of checking out of politics altogether, looking for news and value and meaning and belonging elsewhere, loss of faith in our institutions, and it all gets quite worrying pretty quickly.
We're seeing odd things happening now in a massive way, aren't we? And there's a real question about whether it's going to get back to what we used to call normal at all. I mean, the utter collapse of trust in politics, I should say, as it was, means that people are turning away from what we used to call the two main parties. Now it's like with the Conservatives in the shape they're in, 1.5 main parties. Will they take the judgment that certainly in the government they hope they're going to take, which is that they're not choosing a government now, they're getting stuff off their chest, blowing off steam? It just may not be the case. And maybe when the time comes to make a final decision, people just say, to hell with all of you. I'm just going to show you how angry I am by voting for this lot, the other lot, the third choice. Break some glass.
Yeah, and there are more and more choices now. There's reform, there's the possibility of a new party to the left of Labour. Obviously, you've got the Greens are having their leadership contest. You've got the national parties in Scotland and Wales. So there are lots of alternatives out there. And then we get back to one of my favourite topics that I know you're a little bit dubious about, which is can a two-party voting system really cope with that kind of fragmentation? But maybe that's a topic for another show.
No, I don't think I do disagree with that. I mean, it's been a long time since two-party politics looked as if it was really sustainable. And we were talking, 3 elections ago about when we had leaders debates, middle of prime time TV in the evening with 5 parties on the platform, all of them, commanding a chunk of the public's attention, and no clarity as to how that election was going to play out. I mean, it's not a new thing, but the disillusionment, which was there then, has now gone deeper and deeper and deeper, to the point that the idea of rooting it out now, it's looking like a really, really difficult task, Sam, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the two-party system with 6 or 7 parties in it is going to be very difficult. I think you'll end up with a ragtag coalition. I think it will probably mirror something like you see in Germany, where not natural allies suddenly band together to keep out one party. I think that party clearly will be Reform. They'll coalesce, I would have thought, the parties on the left to keep Reform out. I think that will cause a lot of further upset in the country and disillusionment. But, we've got a long way to go before the next election. A lot can happen. We've seen that in the past 5 years. But I do think that there is a real problem with trust, and I think actually that is because people they voted for a Labour government, nothing changed. They voted for Brexit, nothing changed. They become very frustrated when the only thing they can do is cast their vote at the ballot box and nothing changes. But I think also for politicians, for so many years, they have spent a lot of time getting rid of power, devolving power, handing power to international institutions, to quangos that are unaccountable. And suddenly when they get into power and they want to do something, they don't have the ability to do what they've promised. And they're, I think, finding that actually giving away power is not really a good thing to do.
All right, Sam, what's your thought for the day?
Well, I don't want to abuse the system, John, but I've actually got 2. Believe it or not, I've had 2 thoughts, but they are about the same subject. And it was this quite astonishing phone call that Gary O'Donoghue, who I know is your former colleague at the BBC, he used to work in Westminster, very lovely man, received this very a surprise call from the president. I think he was in bed, safely tucked up asleep, and all of a sudden he had this phone call. Gary, Mr. President's on the line for you, and suddenly had to carry out an interview, wake himself up, shake himself from his slumber, carry out an interview with the leader of the free world. Obviously, he did that with aplomb. The first thought that struck me from it was actually, we know how close Nigel Farage and Donald Trump are, and I wonder if Nigel Farage did ever make it into number 10, whether we would see him adopt the similar tactics of Trump in relation to how he deals with the press. Does it suddenly become a case of certain journalists are picked out in the middle of the night to get phone calls without much preparation? Is it something where actually you shake up their version of the lobby system? Do you suddenly shake it up and boot out some of the old guard and bring in these young insurgent websites who may be slightly supportive of the party? And then the other thought was, he had this interesting comment. Gary asked him about when he was shot and how he feels about that. And Trump said something along the lines of, I try not to think about it, I prefer to think positively. And then he had this strange phrase. It was something like, also, I prefer to think it's positive non-thinking, which actually really struck me as actually quite insightful, because sometimes maybe it is better not to pick that scab. He's worried that if he thinks about it too much, it could be life-changing. That those were the words he used, life-changing. And actually, clearly some people do need a lot of help, but actually sometimes maybe it is better not to pick that scab and say, maybe we can take some words of wisdom from Donald Trump.
Yeah, it was an interesting answer, wasn't it? Especially in the background. It's something we have heard Donald Trump say over and over again in speech after speech, and those around him even more loudly, that the shot was fired at Butler, Pennsylvania. It did not kill him, and he considers that a sign that God spared his life, and he was now on a divine mission to save America. That's a slightly different tone to the answer that we had this morning. Yeah,
but I think either way, it is his way of coping with clearly a traumatic event, actually, that might make somebody else take to the bed for a year.
But the platform response is the one we're more used to.
Yes, absolutely. But I think it was just a very interesting way to reflect on that.
I guess faith and thinking, sort of logical thinking, are quite different anyway. So maybe he has this sense, this kind of feeling that doesn't necessarily come from logic, but that this is
divine mission.
A divine mission, the will of God, and that helps him in a way not have to think about it because it's all in God's hands.
That's one way of describing.
Sorry, I'm psychoanalyzing Donald Trump. It's something that I've tried really hard over the past decade not to do.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you've got to get over the obstacle in the way of the idea that God was a Republican in the last American election. That's maybe a bit of a stretch, if you're being completely objective about it.
I don't think I'm the right person to ask about this. Actually, the person that we would normally ask about this is Tim Montgomery, who Sam is filling in for. So I'm tossing the question to Sam.
Well, faith is really not my area of expertise, being a committed atheist. But all I would say is I'm sure God is impartial. You know, he created us all in theory, so he loves us all equally, surely.
Yeah, well, the Lord moves in mysterious ways, as does Donald Trump a lot of the time. I want to talk about the big story here now. Thanks for those thoughts. The Afghan leak, data leak, that we're told might have endangered maybe 100,000 Afghans who were helping the British government. Spoke first today, naturally, to Larisa Brown, who's the Times defence editor. She was right at the front of this story, has been living with it, working on it for years now. Not that we could know that, because it was absolutely blanketed by a super injunction, which means you not only can't talk about the story, you can't know about the story, you can't even refer to the fact that there's a ban on talking about the story. Well, Larisa, she made the point there were so many questions still unanswered.
I'm not quite clear how that mistake could have happened. I'm not clear who he sent it to, exactly how many people he sent it to. Has he faced investigation, or has anyone taken the fall for this? Who is to blame? I mean, this individual, we are told, was under the command of General Sir Gwyn Jenkins. He's the current head of the Navy. He was Director of Special Forces at the time. Is he going to face any repercussions as a result? There's so much more, and even today, all the Afghans are being told in Afghanistan that their data's been breached. They don't know the full story. A lot of the hearings were behind closed doors. We couldn't be in them. We've been hit with a fresh injunction in the last day. We can't reveal details of what's in that database. We've seen it, we've analysed it, but I still can't talk about it. Even the full extent of who's coming, it's all a bit unclear.
Larisa Brown there. I spoke to the former Afghan MP, Fawzia Kofi, who told me about those left behind.
And I was recently in Pakistan visiting these families that they were waiting for, the final resettlement in the UK, but also in other countries in the US and Germany. And we also know, this is also stated in the UN Special Rapporteur's report for Afghanistan, that there are a lot of cases of extrajudiciary killing, arbitrary detention of especially our former security forces. And I think this is because of the fact that, some of these data reached to the Taliban.
That's Fawzia Kofi, former Vice Chair of the Afghan National Assembly. But I spoke to Luke Pollard, who, of course, is the Armed Forces Minister. I talked about the threat to those on the database. So there is a possibility that people were and are being punished and Taliban is carrying out its retribution, isn't there? You can't rule it out.
No, I mean, you're right in the fact that there's remains a risk to everyone in Afghanistan.
Including people who are affected by the leak.
Possibly so, but this needs to be viewed in the wider context of what information is available to the Taliban already, what is their intent, and where are they focusing. And the independent review, not something that ministers have come up to the conclusion ourselves. We've commissioned someone, a credible expert who spoke to people on the ground in Afghanistan, people that the previous assessment used by the last government weren't able to take on board. They've come to a different conclusion.
It's the Armed Forces Minister, Luke Pollard. Now, the Afghan veteran, Hamish de Bretton Gordon, spoke about the security risks posed by the leak.
Has everybody been vetted, to the best of our ability to make sure that there aren't any bad actors, as it were, in there? Because we know that, that Afghanistan has been the sort of the place where Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as well as the Taliban, have developed. Well, I assume rather than hope that the state, the government knows who all these people are, and now we need to do some reverse vetting to make sure that there aren't some really bad actors in there. But that is obviously an issue, and I assume, and I'm pretty sure, that the security service and counter-terror police and the border force will be all over this. If they're not, they jolly well should be.
Hamish de Bretton Gordon. Now, the chair of the Defence Committee at the time of the Afghan withdrawal, Tobias Ellwood, he told me he understood why the super injunction was in place.
We need to learn more, I think is fair to say. I was surprised to learn that the super injunction had been removed. Somebody's made a judgment to say that there is no danger in this information now getting out to the public, as we're discussing now. But the reason why it was placed there after this enormous blunder was to protect the very people that we had a duty of care for, to get in a scheme that would then work to make sure that there wouldn't be reprisals. Now, if the judgment has been made that risk has disappeared, then I can understand why that super injunction has now been lifted.
Tobias Ellwood there. And in the last hour, the Reform leader Nigel Farage waded in via a video posted on X.
Amongst the number that have come are convicted sex offenders. I am not, I promise you, making any of this up. And the total cost of the operation has been a staggering £7 billion. Of those that came, none of them were included in the immigration figures. There has been a total veil of secrecy put upon this by the last Conservative government and frankly carried on until now by the current Labour government. The numbers are off the charts. The cost is beyond comprehension. And the threat to women walking the streets of this country, frankly, is incalculable.
Nigel Farage. Well, we'll get your thoughts of Sam Lister and Rachael Cunliffe on this in just a moment. I'm going to be talking to a professor from UCL who worked in Afghanistan for a period funded by the British government. He was helping those who were seeking to get to this country, helping with that resettlement programme. He has a lot to say about what we've heard from the government on this story today. This is John Pienaar on Times Radio. Pienaar and Friends with Barclays Business Banking. Grow your business. Bank on Barclays.
Business banking. Grow your business. Bank on Barclays.
Sam Lister's here with me on Pienaar Friends, as in Rachael Cunliffe from the New Statesman. And now we've been joined by a professor at University College London, Professor Brad Blitz. Welcome to you.
Hello, thank you very much.
It's good to have you with us. Now Brad, you're a listener to the programme. You wrote into us a little bit earlier on the basis of your experience. You were paid for by the British government conducting research in Afghanistan for a period of 2 years. And you worked to resettle Afghan colleagues in this country. They were defenders of human rights. And on the basis of what you heard from the Minister earlier on today, you had a number of issues and problems with what you heard. Just set out your concerns.
Can I just clarify? I was engaged working on Afghanistan, working with people in Afghanistan from 2019.
Yes.
Our research came to a halt after 2021.
Yeah.
The research was not on the resettlement of Afghans. That resulted from the research project when people were exposed to significant risk from the Taliban and they sought resettlement.
Well, understood. So you were working among people who were seeking to escape Afghanistan for this country. And, well, you had various problems with what you heard from the Defence Secretary. Just tell us a bit about that.
Right. So first of all, I think the Defence Secretary and indeed what we've heard from a number of officials undermines the actual threat, both faced to Afghanistan's and the threat to the United Kingdom. This was a very serious data breach. The estimate of 100,000 could in fact be an underestimate, given the size of Afghan families, given our experience in terms of the numbers who've requested relocation. That's the first thing. The second thing is people were not contacted. They weren't contacted at the point when there was an obvious risk. Some people may have been killed. Some people may have been tortured as a result of this. In any event, that risk hasn't gone away. The third thing is that we had a secret scheme that was operating in conjunction, or rather in parallel, I should say, with the official Afghan schemes. We don't know how this was administered. But what we do know is that during the period when this scheme, this Operation Rubifik was operating, those other schemes were being run down. And as a result, most people who applied for resettlement were rejected. All 232 people on our list were rejected by the British government, while other people apparently were being admitted. And we just don't know how that operated. There's absolutely no accountability here.
Yeah. And you also mentioned, as well as your concern about people who were left at risk in Afghanistan, you were also concerned about a risk to British national security. Just tell me about that.
Well, the risk that I see, first of all, is that the tremendous cost that this has cost the British government will mean that there's simply less money in the overseas development pot. The fact that we're talking about some £7 billion that's been allocated to this is about 50% of the current annual ODA budget. And as a result of that, we can only imagine that there will therefore be less money to be spent, whether it's in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, or Syria or elsewhere. This is a huge amount of money. This is a very, very serious mistake.
I see. And what about the argument that some people, bad actors is the phrase that's always used, people who wish this country ill, may have used the secret channel to get people at risk into this country as a means of getting here and doing harm, planning to do harm. Do you buy that argument too?
Well, that is possible. The point is we know nothing about this scheme. We've only just learnt about it. We don't know who was admitted. We don't know the criteria under which they were admitted or brought to this country. What we do know is, and in this instance, Nigel Farage is correct, the Home Office data do not reflect those numbers. So we don't even know the total number of people who may have benefited from the scheme. And what's more, it's quite clear, not only from his comments today, but based on now what we have heard, that the Defense Secretary really does not have a handle on not just the numbers of people, but the data as they currently exist. The Home Office data have not been updated in 4 years with respect to the resettlement of Afghans.
Okay.
So we really do not know anything about who came and how many people came.
All right. Sam Lister is here from the Express and Rachael Cunliffe from the New Statesman. Brad, Sam.
Yeah, I think that's really a very interesting point. If the Defence Secretary does not have a grip on this, then I think that really will worry people. Is it the Home Office? Are they hiding these figures? What is the issue here? And I think there's two things, aren't there? I think as a nation, we understand our obligation to those in Afghanistan who supported us and worked alongside our troops out there and fed information to us. And I think most people feel a deep sense of obligation to those people. But clearly, I think you are suggesting that also their wider families can be quite big, and it's that side of things where we don't quite know who is coming in or who has come in. Is that correct?
Well, that's certainly part of it. But even going back to Operation Pitting, even going back to the evacuation in August 2021, the Home Office statistics say, if you look at the footnotes, they say, first of all, the data under these Afghan schemes are provisional. They've been saying this for the last 4 years. And then the next footnote says, the data on Afghan resettlement and relocation schemes includes some British nationals who were evacuated from Afghanistan, but who do not require a grant of leave to stay in the United Kingdom. So the figures were just amalgamated. We don't know how many Afghans were actually brought to the United Kingdom, and we don't know who they were.
Rachel Cunliffe.
I'm just trying to think of this from the perspective, I guess, of the ministers who found out about it, I think 18 months after the breach occurred. So what it would have occurred when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister would have landed on Rishi Sunak's desk in August 2023. And I'm trying to put myself in that position and wondering, knowing that happened, that the lists were out there and that there were individuals who were threatening to publish them, was there another option? Then was the option to say we're not going to resettle people? Was the option to say we're going to resettle people but make everything public so we don't have this sort of 2-year super injunction when no one can report on it? I think it's a very thorny issue of the importance of accountability and transparency versus the importance of governments fulfilling their moral obligations when there has been a screw up on this scale. And I was sort of quite taken by Tobias Elwood's comments about sort of the reasoning behind all of this, and I'd just be interested in basically in everyone's thoughts as to was there an alternative?
Well, Tobias was taking the government side in the question of disclosure, well, to the people on the list that they were on the list, and he considered, he agreed with the government judgment at the time, which is endorsed by this government, that it would have been too risky, that it would just risk the wider leaking of that material. Now, on the other side, you've got a counter argument which says that, look, these people were left in danger without knowing it. It is admitted now that the Taliban may have got hold of this material anyway.
Yeah.
And you just got to put them on their guard in a way that was not done. So those are the two sides of it. I mean, Brad, what's your take on that? Should the people on the list have been told they were on the list?
I think they should have been told that they were on the list. They should have been told that there was a risk to them as a result of this data breach. So they might have been able to take some precautions. They might have been able to relocate internally. I don't know exactly. What I would say, however, is that the risk that Afghans face has not gone away. And it's not simply as a result of this data breach. So coming back to the fact that we know of individuals who have applied for resettlement who are at risk, but those claims were rejected. And now we have another population that is at risk, if not because of what they did before 2021, as a result of this data breach. And those people may have been admitted, some of them, apparently some 23,000 people have been resettled, but large numbers haven't. There's been a complete derogation of responsibility. And unfortunately, I would say the British government has now put large numbers of people's lives at risk as a result of the way in which they've managed both these schemes and the release of data and the management of that data after it has been released as well.
And while you're making that point, Brad, I'm being told that the government's now announced that there will be a data incident self-checker, so people can check for themselves whether they are part of that list.
And in fact, I received a screenshot today from a colleague who went on the self-checker and found, sure enough, that his data had been released and he and his family are at risk.
Yeah.
And this comes from one self-motivated, educated individual who did so. We don't know how many others are in that situation.
How did your friend react to learning that?
Was truly alarmed, and this was at the point I was just writing to your studio, actually, to say, look, that there's a much bigger story here, both in terms of the risk that has been created by the British government, but also the fact that the Defence Secretary and others believe this can be brushed aside with simply an apology. It can't. This is a very, very serious situation.
Right.
It is going to cost the British government and the British and Britain a huge amount of money, which will come out of the overseas development pot, and there's been no accountability.
All right, Brad, thank you for calling in. Our listener, Professor Brad Blitz, there. I have to move on just because the clock is instructing me to move on. You're listening to Pienaar and Friends with Sam Lister, Rachael Cunliffe, and me, John Pienaar. After the news, we're going to be catching up on what happens after 7 o'clock with Kate Borsay, and we will be crossing live to the United States. And we're just picking up the aftermath of that announcement from Donald Trump about the action he was contemplating to get Russia to the negotiating table in the Ukraine war. Are his threats, is his ultimatum entirely credible? We will talk about it. This is John Pienaar on Times Radio. It's time for the news with Laura Cook.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thank you. Good evening. Downing Street has declined to say whether the official responsible for the Afghan data breach has faced disciplinary action. The first UK government super injunction over the Ministry of Defence breach was lifted today after a court battle led by The Times and Defence editor Larisa Brown, who had been barred from acknowledging its existence. Number 10 also wouldn't commit to never again using a super injunction to prevent reporting of its actions. Hamish de Breton Gordon is a British Army officer who served in Afghanistan and feels strongly about the impact of this breach.
The fact that so much data can be leaked, by the press of a keyboard is pretty shocking. This information going into the public domain after, our very hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I accept was not the fault of the British government, caused a number of issues. And we're talking about a lot of people, a lot of Afghans who fought with us, who helped us throughout the time in Afghanistan, then potentially put at great risk.
As the gag order on the Taliban kill list remained in force, the government signed off a £7 billion plan to secretly evacuate thousands of Afghans affected. A lawsuit involving some 900 of those affected across the world is being prepared against the government and is expected to cost at least £250 million. Presenter John Pienaar's been sacked from MasterChef days after Greg Wallace was also let go. An allegation against him was upheld concerning what the BBC call an extremely offensive racist term, something he says he doesn't remember at all. 2 men have been jailed for more than 4 years each for cutting down the sycamore gap tree in September 2023. Sentencing judge Mrs Justice Lambert accused the former friends, aged in their 30s, of revelling in the thrill of it. The grandparents of a 2-year-old boy have been found guilty of his murder. Ethan Ives Griffiths was found severely underweight, dehydrated and bruised in North Wales in August 2021. And Adolescence has been bumped up to 30 Emmy nominations. It's thought at 15 Owen Cooper is the youngest actor to have made the shortlist. And for news when you want it, subscribe to our podcasts, The Times News Briefing and The World in 10.
This is Times Radio.
Times Radio with Barclays Business Banking. Find out how Barclays can help to move your business forward. Search Barclays Business.
I'm John Pienaar. With me here, Sam Lister from the Express and Rachael Cunliffe from the Statesman, and Kate Borsay, who takes over at 7. Hello, Kate.
Hiya, John. Look, we'll be continuing to open up and expand and discover, ask more questions, consider more ramifications of that Afghan data breach, which the Times has been leading the reporting on so well today after a 2-year fight to get a super injunction lifted. We're going to be speaking to Jeremy Griffin, the executive editor of the Times, for a bit of behind-the-scenes context. We'll also hear from Arthur Snell, a former British diplomat who worked in Afghanistan and a man who worked with the British Army for 10 years in Afghanistan, who is in Kabul. He's on the list. He's had that message, had that email from the government today, and will be able to tell us or not whether he feels that the danger he is in potentially has lessened or not, as it has done, according to John Healey, the Defence Secretary. Feels the threat is not what it was, and that's why the secret scheme has now closed to bring any Afghan on that list over to the UK. So some will, of course, remain in Afghanistan. And our guest could potentially be one of those. So we'll be speaking to him on the show as well. We'll get some fascinating insight there. We'll also be joined by Colin Brazier, former news anchor. He reported from Afghanistan for Sky News, and Michael Binion, the paper's former diplomatic editor, for historical context on this story as well. So plenty on that. We'll also be speaking to Alan Dershowitz, the US law professor, represented both Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump in separate cases, I should say. But he believes that the failure to look any further into the so-called Epstein files is the fault of 2 judges in New York and not about suppression from Donald Trump and his Attorney General, Pam Bondi. He'll give us the reasoning behind that on the show this evening. And the 2 men found guilty of taking down the Sycamore Gap, taking down that tree, have been sentenced today, quite sort of hefty sentences. We'll be speaking to Guy Opperman, who was the MP of Hexham during that whole period in which the tree was felled, who'll tell us that it's still a really emotive issue within the area. And the mind-boggling thing for many people is that there is still no motive. And one of the senior detectives involved said today, we may genuinely never know what the motive was. The 2 men's defence today was that it was that they were drunk, but the judge didn't accept that at all. So there is still a great question locally of why would you do this? Why would you wreck this? And it is a very emotionally connected site in that area and beyond. So we'll get, again, some really fascinating insight from Guy Opperman. Looking forward to tonight. Loads of really important stories, John.
Lots there for you to chew through. Looking forward to that, Kate, after this show at 7 o'clock. You're on Times Radio. Now, let us cross stateside and welcome to the programme. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends. Molly Wall from the Wall Street Journal. Hi, Molly. Hi.
Hello there. How are you?
It's great to have you here. I'm really, really well. There's a lot we want to talk about, Molly, in the time that we've got. I want to pick up the thread, first of all. We've got Rachel here with me and Sam as well. Pick up the threads from yesterday. About this time yesterday, we were bringing everyone the news of Donald Trump's ultimatum to Vladimir Putin. 50 days was the ultimatum. Come to the table was the ultimatum, or he was going to act. They would be secondary sanctions. It was a little bit confusing exactly what he meant by that, but later on I think the White House tried to clarify that by saying it meant action against Russia and against countries doing business with Russia. Now that includes China, and if we're talking about acting against China because of its oil buying from Russia, that's a massive disruption potentially to the energy market. And if you roll in 100% tariffs, because that's what Trump was talking about, to all imports into America, well, that's going to have a big impact on the American economy. Now, what I'd love to hear from you now, Molly, is, so that was pretty dramatic stuff. 24 hours on, how credible is that threat being judged to be?
I think it's very critical. I mean, we have just reported today that in his conversation a couple of weeks ago with Zelensky, President Trump inquired about whether it would be possible to Moscow. He's clearly thinking in dramatic terms here. He's clearly, as we've seen publicly and privately very frustrated with Vladimir Putin, and he's expressing that in a lot of ways. We've spoken before about the sanctions bill that has been pending in the Senate that continues to be on hold in part because of these ultimatums that Trump is making. There's a feeling that if consequences are to be dangled on Russia, the president can do that himself if he's so inclined. But it's obviously in these past few weeks we've seen a dramatic reversal by Trump in his sort of stance toward Putin, and he seems to be quite serious.
Yeah, and we saw that after the threat was made yesterday. What happened in the Russian markets? Well, they went up. There was relief in Russia that Russia was being given 50 days. They clearly calculated that 50 days is a long time. We don't need to get worried about this. There's every reason to believe that it won't actually happen. That was how that was being interpreted. And the sort of scepticism that I'm keen to get your thoughts on comes down to, if this threat was carried out, if all this has got heavy ifs in front of it, if it were to be that America were to say, look, Russia, you have not come to the table, we're going to punish people doing business with you. That means that means China, because China buys your oil. Well, 100% tariffs. It means that the oil market is going to be massively disrupted. It means that Chinese goods pouring into America now, they're not going to be pouring into America now in anything like the same way. It will mean prices going up. It will mean gasoline prices going up. It'll mean a trade war with China, for the sake of Donald Trump supporting Ukraine, which is something he's been so reluctant to do, more than reluctant to do so far. Those are the other doubts. But and those doubts clearly exist, Molly.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the skepticism is clearly well placed, right? I mean, Trump has been all over the map on this issue, and it has taken him this long just to sort of get tough on Putin to the extent that he has. And I think anyone who's watched his actions with respect to tariffs has plenty of reason to question whether he is going to carry out sort of any of the many ultimatums that he's put on the table. I mean, again, I think in his public utterances, he's been pretty frank about the fact that he expected this to be a lot easier. He thought Putin was going to be easier to deal with than he has turned out to be, and that's obviously frustrating for the Ukrainians, for one, and for everyone who would like to see the United States be more on Ukraine's side in this conflict. I think, domestically, allies of Trump who also want to see the U.S. support the Ukrainians are rather relieved that he's gotten to this point, as opposed to where he was in that first meeting with Zelensky in the Oval Office. Yes. But you're absolutely right that there's plenty of reason for skepticism, both of this ultimatum and of the idea that he would eventually do anything. Now, of course, anyone who gives an ultimatum, it's an unappealing outcome, and they don't want to get to that point, right? Yeah. They'd prefer to make the deal, and Trump would clearly prefer to make the deal, but he is coming to the realization, which I think anyone who's spent a long time on this issue would have liked to be able to have told him on day one, but he has at least belatedly come to the realization that Putin doesn't actually want to end the war. Yeah. And so where we go from here is a real test of these diplomatic skills that Trump has talked so much about.
So it is. The line to you is a little bit shaky, Molly. Forgive us. We're just going to try and get a clearer line to you. But just in the meantime, President Trump has now been speaking to reporters in Washington who were asking him about the 50-day deadline, the ultimatum to Vladimir Putin.
Well, at the end of 50 days, if we don't have a deal, it's going to be too bad.
Should Zelensky get more aggressive?
The tariffs are going to go on and other sanctions go on.
Should Zelensky target Moscow? Should Zelensky target Moscow, sir? Should Zelensky target Moscow or deeper into Russia?
No, he shouldn't target Moscow.
Is that why you gave him more weapons, though?
So that's President Trump talking just a short while ago, still talking tough about his ultimatum to Vladimir Putin. But it also was reported earlier that in a conversation with Zelensky in early July, Donald Trump, who was at that stage pretty clearly, it is said, losing patience with Putin, he asked Zelensky, could you hit Moscow? Could you hit St. Petersburg? That caused obviously a stir. Now that report came out. Now he's saying that he did not wish to see Zelensky or Ukraine attacking Moscow. I mean, Rachel and and Sam, what do you make of all of this? It is still hard to see Trump following up that threat with exactly that kind of action.
Yeah, and I think Russia clearly know that. We've had a response from Sergei Lavrov today. Obviously, he is a man, the Russian foreign minister, he's a man who doesn't mince his words. We know that. But he says Moscow's been through all of this before, 50 days, then 24 hours and 100 days. We've been through all of that. The Putin spokespeople are also briefing that they don't see any threat from this. They don't believe there will be any threat in reality from Trump's suggestion of 100% tariffs. So Russia's not taking it seriously. What I thought was interesting, though, and this is a slight side issue, but so do forgive me, but the Melania Trump's role in all of this, because the president obviously referred to how he'd come off this call with Putin, a really good call, and he'd been chatting to the First Lady, and she'd said, oh, well, that's all very strange because I've put the TV on and they seem to be bombing Ukraine. And it now seems that Melania Trump is getting an awful lot of love in Ukraine. There are lots of activity on social media calling her Melania Trumpenko. She put in the Ukrainian insignia on a beret on her head. So, but I just, so there is somebody's commented that she's done more for Ukraine in one conversation than the Grand Old Party has done in the last 2 years. So, I think it is a side issue, but clearly, I think the threat of tariffs, nobody really is taking them seriously because you just look at Trump's track record on tariffs, and it's not been straightforward, has it?
I do remember some years back when Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump's daughter, was credited with influencing his mind and changing his mind on the subject of Syria. Do you remember after one of those chemical attacks, she was said to have remarked how awful that is and been deeply, deeply moved and made that clear to her father. And that was at the time, it was suggested that was one of the reasons why he took a harder line on Syria. I know, what are you thinking, Rachel?
Oh, I think we've had a real insight into Donald Trump's sort of decision-making and psychology from some of the comments that he himself has made. So I was also struck by the admission that Melania has made him think about it in a different way. But he also said, after speaking with Putin on the phone, I always hang up and say, well, that was a nice phone call. And then some missiles are launched and I say, strange. And after that happens 3 or 4 times, you say, the talk doesn't mean anything. And you feel like sort of screaming at the computer screen. We all knew that. I mean, I remember more than a couple of months ago, Russia, the ball's in your court. And you can really see why the Russians are not taking it seriously, not least because it's not backed up by anything. It's so clear that even though Trump is losing patience with Putin, and he is, there's no desire, willingness, kind of even wanting to contemplate that America could get involved in a more significant way. They're not donating the missiles and the equipment, they're selling them to NATO. He constantly says, this is not Trump's war, this is not a Republican war, we don't like war, we just want to end the war. And so if you're Vladimir Putin looking at that, you're going, there is no appetite from America whatsoever to take on any risk from this. Even the tariffs come with huge risks. We've talked about spike in the oil price if the tariffs are imposed on China that buys Russian oil. So at any point where it impacts America in even the slightest negative way, they're not going to want to get involved. So what incentive is there from Russia to take this seriously?
And we're going to get some more thoughts from Molly Ball and the Wall Street Journal in just a moment. This is Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio with Barclays Business Banking. Find out how Barclays can help move your business forward. Search Barclays Business.
Intelligent tools for your service agents to make customers happier. All built into a single platform you can use right now. That's why the world works.
And here with me on Pienaar Friends, Sam Lister from the Express and Rachael Cunliffe from the New Statesman, and Molly Ball on the line from the USA of the Wall Street Journal. Molly, just also to get us up to clearer into the picture on the reaction since yesterday, we're talking about, the scepticism in some quarters that Donald Trump would follow through on his ultimatum to Putin. It's also true, isn't it? There are some in his own camp, in the MAGA camp, who are unhappy to hear what they have heard so far. They think it's not what America First is all about.
That's right. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, who is a staunch Trump ally, who I think really embodies the MAGA perspective, has been tweeting about the fact that this is everything that MAGA stands against. MAGA doesn't believe even in selling weapons to Ukraine. I mean, I think she made the argument that since the U.S. Funds NATO, we're basically paying for those weapons anyway. And she's been very consistent on this issue. And there is a feeling among many of her fellow travelers in MAGA that I don't think they would ever accuse Trump himself of selling them out, but they feel like the neocons got to him, like the forces in the more traditional sort of Republican Party, the Mitch McConnells of the world, the more sort of traditionally hawkish Reagan Republicans. They seem to be the ones sort of driving the bus in the administration, even though this administration came in with so many promises that those people would have no place and would have no voice, that the John Boltons of the world were in permanent exile. Nonetheless, those types of views, as MAGA sees it, appear to be influencing Trump at this moment, whether that's because of the interactions he's had with Putin that have changed his perspective or whatever else. So while I certainly understand the perspective that Trump is still just all talk and he's still giving Putin a free ride in essence, and that's all true, it still is enough to set off some of his core supporters that he's even gone this far, because it is so different from what they perceive he stood for in the past.
Right, Molly, thanks so much for joining us. It's always great to get your input into these conversations. You'll be called upon again, I have no doubt whatsoever. Molly Ball there from the Wall Street Journal. Now, just got a few minutes left for the top of the programme. I did want to get your thoughts, Sam and Rachel, on this story about vaccination and vaccination hesitance in this country. We've been hearing, haven't we, over recent days, about worries about a measles outbreak on Merseyside in Liverpool. And today there's the news that the World Health Organization, along with UNICEF, is recording that Britain is the worst performing country in the G7 group of industrial advanced economies when it comes to coverage of measles, when it comes to the take-up of the MMR vaccine. And this, Sam and Rachel, this is really worrying stuff.
Truly worrying, but I think it's interesting. It kind of ascribes certain reasons to that decline, which I'm not sure I completely buy. Now, clearly these are expert people. I don't want to, they've studied it and I haven't, so let's put that out there. But they are talking about a decline in access to GP services and a lower rate of health funding. But I'm not sure that is the issue, really. For me, it does feel more about the actual vaccine hesitancy issue. And I know, really, it doesn't take an awful lot to organise for. When I was young, I remember we queued up and you were just jabbed in turn. The whole class would be done in an afternoon, and I'm sure that can be organised pretty easily without costing loads of money. It doesn't require every family to go to their GP and have their child vaccinated. You can put a health visitor into a school. The whole class can be done in an afternoon. That, to me, seems sensible and doesn't take an awful lot of money. So I cannot believe that is the issue, which leaves you to think, well, it is this growing scepticism which started about 20 years ago. Obviously, we know there were certain reports about the impact that vaccinations could have on children. There was this totally erroneous link to autism, and I think that just planted a big seed of doubt in many people's minds, and I don't think we've ever really recovered from that.
Yeah, I mean, that had a massive knock to the level of vaccinations.
Really
and I saw a poll finding reported today, 38% of people believe that the COVID pandemic was exaggerated for the purpose of the state exerting more control over people.
It's just astonishing.
And when you're up against that you would think that's going to weigh more than a momentary shortage of vaccines in a particular clinic. And when it's all magnified, as of course it is by social media, well, you can understand it. You may deplore it, but you can understand it.
I think it can be both things, can't it? It can be hesitancy, scepticism that the government has your best interests at heart, misinformation online, and also lack of resources, because it's not just your GP offering the jabs, it's also the chasing up and the follow-ups. And if you think about just the amount of paperwork that goes missing, I mean, I frequently get letters inviting me to healthcare appointments at times in the past that I've already been to, but you know, if I hadn't had that letter, I might have missed I might have missed them. So, you know, partly it's about organisation as well, and just having the database to remind parents and to check up on them. I actually think I don't know about the feasibility of this, but the MMR vaccine is usually given first dose, I think, at 12 months and second dose at 18 months. So would it be viable to have a programme first year in school? I mean, Labour are introducing free childcare for, I think it's from the age of 2 onwards or less. So, you know, and they want to build that into schools. So could you build a vaccination programme as part of that? I think would be a really interesting question. And then you've also got the sort of people just feeling checked out from the state. I think it's really interesting looking at those numbers. It goes back to your earlier point. About distrust. Yeah, looking at the numbers, I think the coverage over the whole country is 85%. You want it to be at 95% to get full herd immunity so everyone is protected. But it's worse in London. And is there an issue there with maybe ethnic minority communities that feel that the healthcare system hasn't always had their best interests at heart, or who feel a certain language or just alienation from the areas of the state where you want them to engage with it, and what can be done on that front? But it's a really crucial issue, because basically we managed to eliminate measles. That's a fantastic human scientific achievement, and to now be going backwards is really quite terrifying.
And with that sort of, I don't know, that cocktail of language barriers, of cultural barriers, of mistrust, that would help to explain why in the London borough of Hackney in East London, which is a very ethnically diverse part of London, the take-up of vaccines is 60%. That's way below the 95% that you need for herd immunity. Enormous problem. I mean, you've got Liverpool talking about the possibility of this measles outbreak spreading like wildfire. You can see the alarm. Anyway, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. It is an interesting story as well as a concerning one. Thank you for coming in. Good to talk to both of you, Sam Lister and Rachael Cunliffe. Thank you all of you for listening. Our producers today, Ollie Cole and Angus Mitchell. Our technical operator, Robin Warren. I'm going to be back tomorrow. Kate Borsey is up next, and this is Times Radio.
Across the UK on DAB.